We are now going to proceed to the open discussion with the keynote speakers, and I will therefore open for questions. I myself actually have one, but I will actually start out because I was so inspired by it, and I misuse, I know, that I stand here. But what I heard from both of you actually was that you try to find some kind of integrative model, and because this field gets a bit messy on the one hand, or just so big, so you have to reduce the complexity. And in a sense, it is very persuasive, because when you show all the slides, Martin, then I say, okay, this is quite a complex matter. But on the other hand, I'm not quite sure that it is so easy to get the same language or to reduce the complexity. And my question is, because the premise is that we are talking about competences, but at the same time, I would ask you, is one of the problems not that we are not actually agreeing on if we are talking about competences? Because when I hear you talk about knowledge, being knowledgeable, you also talk about being educated, an educated or literate person, and you also talk about being a skilled person. And if you look behind you, I think there maybe are 4 quite different approaches that we are part of today. That is part of it's not messy at all. I mean, there are different approaches, and they are sometimes in conflict. So the question is to you: is this just a matter of reducing complexity, or is it also a matter of distinct disagreement if the higher education should have a Bildung approach, as Jørgen Ørstrøm, I think, talked about yesterday, shape the person, and not an approach that it has to do with giving them competences, which is, to my mind, quite different. So, what are your reflections about that first question?
Yeah, thank you very much. A very, very good question. And there's no simple answer to that, because it is even as complex as the whole competence discussion. I've been trying indeed to focus on the integration of various competence theories, approaches, models, etc. I also understand that there's much disagreement with finding one model using competence in the first place. Because the critics are saying, well, we can't even define competencies in terms of what is needed in education. I contest that. I think we can. And in my literature study and in the field over the last how many years, I became very much inspired by the work of Prahalat and Hemo from the business side, who were saying that organizations that focus on core competence are doing better. And I translated in my mind that to educational institutions that focus on their core competence do better. Teachers who focus on their core competence and try to find out the core competence in their students do better and develop talent better. How does that relate to personal development? I see it as a component of competence development. Personal development and competence development, in my mind, are very much related to one another. I don't think we should go back to the 50s and 60s in which competence was used to underline the necessity of task-oriented, immediate application-oriented training of military, because that was the origin. And in education, we are not in the training business in the military, because we educate students for the future, and we try to make them independent thinkers, critical, and these things are just the opposite what is being trained in the military, right? It's the command logic, and not the creativity, mindful logic. So, yeah, I come back to that general conclusion from my work that I see competence as a generic construct. That is what people are good at, what they can do, which exists of knowledge elements, deep knowledge, whatever, skills to apply that, and their attitudes, their values, etc. And especially the application part, I am also very much interested in, because I've seen so many educational programs. I've been having students from all over the world, in which students, for instance, from Russia, who were excellent in arts, in psychology, economy, you name it. But in my studies, where I teach them curriculum and instructional theory, etc., they were not able to apply that in real-world problems. If I asked them, can you make an educational plan for this and that group based on whatever, they were empty-handed, and I couldn't understand that. But I thought afterwards, that is because of the education model to replicate knowledge instead of to apply knowledge. And I think a major asset of the competence-based education philosophy is not only the knowledge side, but also the knowledge development, which is needed as the foundation, but that we also teach students how to apply that and give them the room to experiment with that. That's the beginning of an answer.
Okay. Okay. Will you? Okay. Oh, sorry.
Maybe I can answer that question from the OECD DESICO perspective, because we have set out the OECD's key competency framework. But one of the criticism about the framework, while being well received, was it's very difficult for schools and teachers to apply that DESICO concept or theory into practice in the teaching. So teachers actually see that framework from their own views as math teacher or language teacher. So how can I actually teach that in the classroom? So it's very important that this messy world is reorganized for the people who need to implement it. So at least for the school sector, this disciplinary structure is very important. And in order to go further and do this interdisciplinary thinking, you need the basic disciplinary knowledge to do this. This is very much debated in the last reform in the UK by Michael Young and all these people, the powerful knowledge.
Yes. Okay. Let's open for questions from the audience.
I have two observations. Number one, we talk about competency and capacity. These are the two words usually we come across in the education field. So the competence make a person, the competency make a person competent, and the capacity makes a person capable. So both the things we talk in terms of the performance. So now the question is, when we define the competence and capacities within the broad idea of education, are we not minimizing the spectrum of education and the main object of education? So why I'm saying this is, when you talk about education, you refer to preparing the all-round development of an individual. Therefore, he is in a position to perform the responsibilities that he actually can. I think in this context, you minimize the process to a competency-based education. Then are you not limiting the spectrum of education in the broader sphere? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
If we talk about competence and competence-based education, yeah, it's just a word, huh? And we talk about the competencies and the capabilities, capacities, abilities, whatever. What we do in education is to try to develop talent. And we can use all kinds of models, we can use all kinds of words and exclude competence and develop talent in an inclusive way of developing the young generation in education in an open world as independent, critical thinkers. But what we do is still use in our back of our mind, maybe unconsciously, make them competent in that field. So I want to be a bit going away from the conceptual debate and say that in essence, what we can do is our ability. What we can do, what we can think is our ability. It's our competence. And that results ultimately in performance. And that can be technical performance, skilled, detailed performance, but also inclusive, design, open-ended performance to realize change and transformation. So I don't see the opposite so much. I know that many attempts to implement competence-based education have failed because of the wrong conceptualizations, because of the wrong operationalizations, and also because of the fact that in my country, for instance, it was seen as a good selling point to implement budget cuts. So what we saw is lots of protests some 5 years ago, because institutions for higher education, especially professional higher education, decided, well, if competence-based education says that students should be independent workers and self-regulated learners, we can give them less teaching hours. So less classroom hours. So they can do more on their own. So we can fire a bit, or we can reduce costs on teachers. And all these elements come into that as well. And that makes it sometimes the discussion about the concept of competence a bit difficult, because it's a bit of a concept that has been associated with many of these problems, but not on the essence.
Maybe interesting point, and I can add to your point about the resistance from higher education, not only from teacher side, but also when I was working on the recognition of non-formal, informal learning, the competence-based framework, if that exists, and if the prospective students' prior knowledge or skills can be turned into credits, then they can actually shorten the period of the period of study. So that is less income for higher education institutions too, and also some authoritative, the deans were quite resistant, okay, how valid is this testing and so on. So there were a lot of resistance as well from the prior accreditation of prior learning issues as well.
Maybe I can add one thing, just give an example of my own university, Wageningen University. Not many people may know it. If you're in the field of agriculture, probably you know Wageningen University very well, because in the field of agriculture is the leading university in the world. What we've done is to define key competencies for the whole university, like 15 years ago or something like that. The key competencies were translated into courses, so where they compared with courses and were specified. Courses were evaluated based on that. So we made matrices of courses, of programs, and these competencies. And that led to a better alignment of learning pathways in the programs. We used it in the development of graduate research. It's a small university, but you have 1,700 PhD students running at the moment, 300-400 completions per year. We also used it for competence assessments of students in the bachelor programs for their future orientation. We have a kind of final course, a CAP course, at the end of the program in the master's, in which is also like competence-based. Yet, Wageningen University is known for its big freedom. Wageningen is the liberation city of the Netherlands. So freedom of choice and identity development, collegiate relationships, no power distance between teachers and students is highly valued. And Wageningen University ranks as the best university already for 12 years at the moment for their education in our country. And we have not many problems with convincing accreditation bodies how we designed those programs, how they are linked to science and to society with these competence approaches. But if you look into the programs and in the self-accreditation or the self-evaluation reports, you will not find much about the word competence, but it's there. It's the background. Just an example.
I'm Professor Pushpanath from India. I would like to share some of the experiences what we did in the Indian curriculum. Somewhere in 1990s, 95, we designed a competency-based curriculum for school education. And then we identified certain competencies required for different age level children in the primary schools. Then we subdivided into sub-competencies and trained the teachers to deliver the way the curriculum is designed. So it went on for a couple of years, then finally we thought the education and the process that's happening in school is exclusively focusing on mastering those competencies. Then the question came that are we not standardizing the learning process? And standardizing learning process is a great danger in the system of education. That was the point. Then another question which came very important was whether these competencies are minimum levels of learning or the maximum level of learning. And then the question comes whether educational process that we actually implement in schools, is it only aiming for minimum levels of learning or something else? I think that was the point when competency-based learning and competency-based education may be a kind of a strategy that teacher can adopt, implicit, but cannot be explicit. That was the perspective. Then gradually the competency-based curriculum is gone back, and today we are talking about constructivistic pedagogy. And that's how we landed up into. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A short comment on that. I know all these developments. I've been in India. I had the pleasure to also present my work there and talk about these notions. There's much more complications than we can talk about today when it comes to the international development of education. And I've seen lots of copying of old conceptualizations and practices of competence-based education in various parts of the world. I have seen time gaps of like 20, 30 years. So it's currently still practices in place that are based on the publications of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think that's wrong. That's sad, it happens. But I think that, and I well respect what you're saying, we should concentrate in education not only on doing things well, but concentrate on the right things. So, and the competency debate helps us, in my mind, to identify the most important things that we want to learn and teach in education. The most important things, the key things that we want students to learn. And if it helps, that is fine. And otherwise, we have to find different ways. But when it comes to constructivist teaching and education and learning, yeah, of course, we all embrace that. Knowledge construction, cooperative knowledge co-creation, and all these things. It does not say that we cannot include or cannot focus on key competencies that people need to learn. I don't think that is a big distinction. We have in our country even had literature about competence-based, constructivistic, social constructivist teaching and education and training. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very relevant question, because that is how we define our framework development. We are not trying to identify ourselves, the OECD identified the right thing, no, because the right thing may vary from country to country across different local contexts. So what we are trying to do is to develop a tool so that each country or region or school can identify the right thing for their own people. So this is why our framework is intentionally multi-dimensional, so that you could capture whatever from different angles that you would like for your people.
Okay. Okay. It's almost time for the coffee break, so I will conclude this session, and I will also conclude it by saying that I think it has been very fruitful to hear you this morning, and also to listen to your answers. And this is because we now have at least a situation where we can hear that we use different ways of expressing what the rationale for lifelong learning is. We listened to Jan Skovsgaard yesterday, and he concluded that the university's main task was to shape the personality, which is a quite clear Bildung approach to my mind. And we hear also today where we have a language about competence that is develop the competences or develop the key competences, and actually I mean we have two more that it has to do with develop the skills or qualification, which is another way of expressing. And the last thing is that the classical approach is to get a knowledgeable person. And of course, I know what you are addressing is that we are now in a time where we are looking for to apply knowledge or perform knowledge. But the old system is still kicking and alive, I think. So thank you. So I think we will have a discussion over the coffee as well. Thank you.